Have you ever spoken the truth, only to be laughed at like you were a fool? Have you ever shared something real, something precious to you, and watched the people around you snicker as if you were telling a fairy tale? That's exactly what happened one Tuesday morning at Prescott Elementary School in Chandler, Arizona, when an 8-year-old boy stood up in front of his entire class and spoke 7 simple words that would change everything. My dad works at NASA. At first, there was silence, the kind that hangs in the air like a weight, heavy and waiting to drop. And then it did. A few kids chuckled. One rolled their eyes. Another whispered, "Yeah, right." But it wasn't the kid's reaction that cut the deepest. It was the teacher, the very person whose job was to encourage, inspire, and uplift young minds. Mr. Bryan, in his perfectly ironed khakis and tucked-in polo, let out a laugh. Not a full, joyful laugh. No, this was a soft, sharp, dismissive laugh, the kind that slices right through a child's heart without anyone even noticing. NASA. Huh. He smirked like Jalen Leon had just claimed his father built spaceships in their backyard. That's quite the imagination. Maybe next time, we aim for something a little more realistic. And just like that, you could almost hear the sound of something breaking inside that little boy. Jalen wasn't some kid spinning wild stories. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. What he said was true. His father wasn't just any man. He was Dr. Kelvin Leon, an aerospace engineer who spent his days designing complex systems that connected Earth to the farthest reaches of space. But in that moment, none of it mattered. One adult's careless laugh had shrunk his entire world down to nothing. What Jalen didn't know, what no one in that classroom knew, was that the truth was already walking toward them, just outside the door. A man wearing a crisp blue blazer, with a shiny NASA badge pinned to his chest, was about to enter that room and change everything. But before that door opened, a little boy's pride had already been shattered. And when the truth finally walked in, it wasn't just Jalen who would be forced to rethink everything. It would be the entire room. Prescott Elementary was buzzing that morning, the kind of electric energy that only came once a year, Career Week. For most third graders, it was the best day ever. A break from spelling tests and multiplication drills. Parents parading in with firefighter helmets, bakery cupcakes, or police badges. Kids sat cross-legged on the storytime rug, fidgeting, whispering, waiting to hear whose mom or dad had the coolest job. But for Jalen Leon, today wasn't just another day. He'd been counting down for weeks, scribbling notes on a crumpled sheet of paper, practicing what he would say in front of the bathroom mirror when nobody was watching. He wanted today to be perfect, because today, for the first time, he'd get to tell the world who his dad really was. When Mr. Bryan called for each student to share what their parents did, the answers were safe, predictable. My dad's a mechanic. My mom runs a bakery. My uncle's a firefighter. The class clapped politely after each answer. And then it was Jalen's turn. He sat up a little taller, chest puffed out, his small hands folded neatly in his lap. He glanced around the room, heart pounding like a drum in his chest, and said the words he'd been rehearsing over and over. My dad works at NASA. The sentence hung in the air for a beat too long. And then, the reaction. A snort from the back of the room. A boy near the window mumbled, "Yeah, right." Someone else giggled behind their hand. But it wasn't the kids that mattered. It was the grown man standing at the front of the class. The one holding the clipboard, the one who should have known better. Mr. Bryan gave a quick, dismissive laugh. His mouth twisted in amusement, eyebrows raised as if Jalen had told the punchline of a joke no one else understood. "NASA, huh? That's quite the imagination," he said lightly. "Maybe next time, we aim for something a little more realistic." The kids laughed louder this time, emboldened by their teacher's reaction. And in that instant, Jalen's heart sank. His voice, once so sure, disappeared into the cracks of the floor. His tiny fists curled into his lap, his eyes dropped to the rug, and the weight of being doubted settled heavily on his small shoulders. But the day wasn't over yet. Not even close. The laugh. That's what stayed with Jalen the most. It wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel in the obvious way. But it cut deeper than any shout ever could. It was the kind of laugh that adults use when they've already decided who you are and what you're worth. A laugh that says, "You're just a kid. You don't know what you're talking about." And after Mr. Bryan's chuckle echoed through the classroom, Jalen felt himself shrink, smaller and smaller. until he wished he could vanish into the pattern of that scratchy classroom rug. The teacher didn't stop to notice the way Jalen's shoulders sagged. He didn't see how Jalen's fingers fidgeted nervously or how his once bright eyes dulled and dropped to the floor. No, Mr. Bryan had already moved on, calling on the next kid, keeping the classroom parade rolling like nothing had happened. But one person did notice. Mila, the quiet girl who sat beside Jalen every day, the one who never raised her voice but always saw things other people missed. She leaned over, her voice barely a whisper amid the chatter of the room. "I believe you," she said. Jalen didn't look up. He only gave the smallest of nods, the kind you make when you're trying not to cry in front of everyone. The rest of the morning blurred past like a fog. Jacob's dad showed up in full firefighter gear. Chloe's mom brought in a tray of sugar cookies and a stack of bakery flyers. Parents came and went, greeted with applause and questions and excitement. And all the while, Jalen sat there, hands folded, lips pressed tightly together, trying to disappear. At lunch, he barely touched his sandwich. He didn't laugh when the other boys started dancing by the vending machines. He didn't race to the swings like he always did. Because when someone you trust laughs at your truth, it feels like the ground's been pulled out from under you. What Mr. Bryan didn't know was that Jalen hadn't made up a thing. His dad really did work at NASA. He wasn't lying. He wasn't pretending. But at 8 years old, it's hard to hold on to the truth when the world tells you it's not real. And in that moment, Jalen wasn't just doubting whether anyone believed him. He was starting to doubt himself. 3 days before career week, in a quiet garage cluttered with old cables and dusty boxes, a very different Jalen sat cross-legged on an overturned milk crate, a Capri Sun in one hand and 1,000 questions ready in his mind. This was his favorite place in the world, not because of the smell of motor oil and soldered wires, but because of the man who worked there, Dr. Kelvin Leon. To the world, he was an aerospace engineer, a man who designed the systems that allowed spacecraft to speak to Earth from millions of miles away. But to Jalen, he was just Dad, the man who could untangle a mess of wires and somehow also untangle the universe so that an 8-year-old could understand it. Wait, so the rover has to wait how long to send a message back to Earth? Jalen asked, slurping the last bit of juice from the pouch. Kelvin didn't even look up from the cables in his hands. Depends on where Mars is in orbit. Anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes. Jalen's eyes grew wide. So, it's like texting someone with really bad service? Kelvin paused, then laughed, a real, deep, warm laugh. Exactly like that. Space has terrible Wi-Fi. This was their rhythm. No big speeches, no lectures, just small, ordinary moments where science became a game and the vast, terrifying universe shrunk down into something Jalen could hold in his hands. Later that night, after dinner, Jalen crept into his dad's study, holding one of the NASA folders like it was a priceless treasure. "Can I show them this at school?" he asked quietly. Kelvin looked up, gentle but firm. "I don't think I'm allowed to bring classified documents to 3rd grade show and tell, buddy. Not even one little page." Kelvin smiled, walking over and kneeling in front of his son. "You don't need the folder. You got something better." "What?" "Your voice. Just tell them what I do. Tell them you're proud." But Jalen hesitated. "What if they don't believe me?" Kelvin leaned back, thoughtful. He knew the world wasn't always kind to boys like his son, boys who dared to dream big. "If they laugh," he said softly, "you keep your head up. The truth doesn't need applause. It just needs to be said." And Jalen, in that moment, believed him. But belief is fragile. And tomorrow, it would be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. The morning of career day, Jalen woke up early. Too early. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, clutching the crumpled piece of paper he had worked on for days. His speech, his words, the ones his dad told him were enough. He practiced every line, every fact about Mars relays and spacecraft systems. He even rehearsed a joke about space Wi-Fi, the one that always made his dad laugh. He smiled at himself in the mirror, proud, ready. But that was before the laugh. By lunchtime, that smile had disappeared. The picture he had drawn the night before, his dad holding the Earth in one hand and a satellite in the other, was now torn into pieces, shoved deep into the bottom of his backpack. Like it had never existed. like he had never believed in it. Because when someone like Mr. Bryan, the person who was supposed to encourage you, laughs at you in front of everyone, something inside you folds in on itself. The excitement Jalen had felt that morning collapsed into a pit in his stomach. His sandwich sat untouched on the cafeteria tray. His friends danced and joked by the vending machines, but he didn't laugh. He didn't race to the swings like usual. He didn't want to talk. He didn't want to dream. Instead, he kept hearing that laugh. The way Mr. Bryan's voice twisted around the word NASA, like it was something ridiculous. The way the kids snickered. The way Mila had whispered, "I believe you." But even that hadn't been enough to patch the crack left behind. And underneath it all, something darker had started to grow. The voice in his head that whispered, "What if he's right? What if my dad's not special? What if I made it all up?" It didn't matter that every night, his dad tucked him in smelling faintly of engine grease and coffee, talking about space missions like bedtime stories. It didn't matter that he'd seen the NASA badge clipped to his dad's jacket every morning before work. One careless laugh had planted a seed of doubt, and by the time the afternoon presentation started, that seed had grown into a storm inside his chest. He checked the clock over and over, wondering, hoping, praying. Would his dad show up? Or would Mr. Bryan's laugh be the last thing everyone remembered? The classroom clock ticked louder than it ever had before. Each minute dragged like an hour as Jalen sat stiff in his seat, eyes flicking anxiously to the door every few seconds. His palms were sweaty, knees bouncing beneath the desk. He didn't hear a word of the other parents' presentations. The mechanic showing off a tire gauge, the baker handing out cookie-shaped business cards. It was all a blur, noise swirling around him like static, because all Jalen could think about was that door, and the question that had burrowed deep into his chest like a splinter. What if he doesn't show up? What if Mr. Bryan was right? What if the kids kept snickering forever? What if today was the day he learned the world really wasn't built for kids who dare to dream big? Mr. Bryan stood near the door, clipboard in hand, occasionally stepping outside to wave in the next parent like he hadn't shattered a little boy's pride earlier that morning. Every now and then, he glanced at Jalen, his jaw twitching slightly, like he wanted to say something but couldn't figure out how. But Jalen didn't look back. 15 minutes left in the day. For parents to go. Jalen's heart thudded in his ears as Mr. Bryan glanced down at his list and opened his mouth to call the next parent. And then, before he could finish, the door opened. The classroom fell into a hush. Standing in the doorway, calm and collected, wearing a navy blue blazer, white shirt, slacks pressed crisp, and clipped just beneath his breast pocket was something that shimmered under the fluorescent lights. A NASA badge. Dr. Kelvin Leon had arrived. He scanned the room with quiet authority, eyes sharp but soft when they landed on his son. He gave the slightest nod, the kind that spoke volumes without a single word. Jalen's chair scraped loudly against the tile as he sat up straight, breath catching in his throat. The classroom had frozen, the usual giggles and chatter evaporating into stunned silence. Mr. Bryan blinked, clipboard forgotten in his hand. And in that moment, without saying a word, the truth walked through the door. Not in a story, not in a picture, but real, undeniable breathing standing right in front of them. And everything was about to change. For a long second, the classroom didn't breathe. The room, so loud, so full of giggles and whispers all day, had gone absolutely still. You could have heard a pencil drop, or a heartbreak, or in this case, a truth finally land like a meteor crashing into everything they thought they knew. Standing at the front of the room was a man none of them expected. Not loud, not showy, just steady, composed, with a quiet gravity that seemed to pull the air toward him. "Hello," Dr. Leon said, voice calm but clear enough to carry. "I'm Dr. Kelvin Leon. I designed spacecraft. No props, no cupcakes, no flashy handouts, just those words, and that NASA badge shining quietly on his chest." The kids who had laughed earlier sat frozen, their mouths parted, eyes wide like they'd just witnessed something impossible. But it wasn't impossible. It was standing right in front of them. And Mr. Bryan? The clipboard in his hand lowered, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. Because in that moment, every snarky comment, every dismissive chuckle from earlier, came crashing back to him like a wave. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Because how do you explain doubting a truth when it's staring you dead in the face? Jalen sat taller than he had all day. His shoulders, which had curled inward like a shield, were now square, lifted. His chin raised slightly, eyes fixed on his dad like he couldn't quite believe it either. Like part of him had been afraid his dad wouldn't come. And now that he was here, the world made sense again. But this wasn't just about a boy and his father anymore. It was about the entire room, the assumptions they'd made, the boundary lines Mr. Bryan had drawn without even realizing it, the quiet message that had lingered all day. Kids like Jalen don't have dads like that. Until now, Dr. Leon didn't have to say a word about what had happened that morning. His presence alone rewrote the story, flipped the script, shattered every doubt hanging in the air. The silence in the room wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was charged. It was realization. And every single person, especially Mr. Bryan, knew, without a doubt, that they'd gotten it wrong. Very, very wrong. Dr. Kelvin Leon didn't need to clear his throat or raise his voice. He had the room the moment he walked in. And now, standing at the front of the classroom, he did something remarkable. He smiled, not a wide, showy smile, but a small, knowing one, and asked, "So, you guys are learning about jobs today?" A few kids nodded slowly, unsure how to react. One brave hand shot up. "Do you fly rockets?" It broke the tension like a pinprick to a balloon. Kelvin chuckled, shaking his head. "Not quite. I help build the systems that allow rockets to talk to us after they leave Earth." He glanced around the room, his voice steady. "Think of it like this. Spacecraft need phones, and we build the phones." Another hand shot up, like space iPhones. That made him laugh again, a real, genuine laugh that reached his eyes. Exactly, but with really, really bad reception. And just like that, the room shifted. The giggles weren't mocking now. They were curious. The questions came, one after another, like a dam breaking. How far can a rocket go? Can you talk to aliens? Is Mars really red? Every answer from Dr. Leon was simple, thoughtful, and kind. Every explanation wrapped in wonder without ever sounding like he was talking down to them. But the most important thing he said came at the very end. He clicked to the final slide on the screen, a photo of him and Jalen, both wearing matching NASA badges, grinning at the Jet Propulsion Lab. And then, without breaking eye contact with the class, he said quietly, "By the way, I heard someone earlier mention that working at NASA might be unrealistic." The words hung in the air like a loaded pause. Kelvin glanced at his son, who now sat taller, brighter, the light returning to his face. "I guess," he continued, "some people have a different definition of what's realistic." That was all he needed to say, because in that moment, the story changed. No one was laughing anymore. No one was doubting. A man had walked into the room and shattered every assumption, every box they tried to fit Jalen and his dreams into. And the one person who felt it the most was standing at the front of the room, holding a clipboard he suddenly didn't want anymore. When Dr. Leon finished speaking, the room erupted in polite applause, but it wasn't like earlier. It wasn't automatic or distracted. It was hesitant, thoughtful, almost apologetic. But the person who didn't clap was Mr. Bryan. He stood frozen near the whiteboard, clipboard hanging useless in his hand, his mouth pressed in a thin, tight line. Because somewhere between Jalen's quiet pride and Dr. Leon calm authority, something inside him had cracked. He hadn't just been wrong. He'd almost crushed a little boy's voice. The rest of career day passed in a blur. Parents came and went, kids smiled and asked questions, but the magic was gone. Nothing could follow what had just happened. Nothing felt important anymore. When the final bell rang and the students packed their backpacks, chairs scraped against the floor, laughter returned, but softer now, like everyone sensed they had witnessed something bigger than career talks and cookie handouts. Except for Jalen. He stayed seated, quietly zipping up his bag, waiting. When most of the class had trickled out into the hallway, Mr. Bryan crossed the room, shifting awkwardly from foot to foot, like the weight of the day hung heavy on his shoulders. "Hey," he started, voice lower than usual. "Your dad. He seems like a pretty smart guy." Jalen looked up slowly, eyes guarded but calm. "He is," Mr. Bryan nodded, clearing his throat like it was stuck. Listen, I wanted to say I may have jumped the gun earlier. I shouldn't have laughed. Jalen didn't respond. Mr. Bryan's jaw tightened. He glanced at the empty desks, then back at the boy he had doubted. What I meant to say is, sometimes teachers, people, make mistakes. We don't always realize when something we say lands wrong. But today I did. Still, Jalen said nothing. His silence wasn't cruel. It wasn't meant to punish. It was the silence of a kid who had learned something grown-ups often forget. That words matter. That sometimes an apology comes too late. Finally, Jalen stood, slinging his backpack over one shoulder. He walked toward the door, pausing just before he stepped out. He glanced back over his shoulder, voice soft but sharp enough to cut through the air. It wasn't my imagination. That's really my dad. And with that, he walked away, head high, truth intact. That evening, the Arizona sky burned orange and pink. The sun dipping low behind the rooftops like it, too, had something to apologize for. In the Leon kitchen, things were quiet. Not uncomfortable, just the kind of quiet that settles in after a long day when words feel too heavy. Jalen sat at the table, slowly stirring a bowl of cereal. Not because he was hungry, but because it felt like the only thing he could control. Across the room, Kelvin leaned against the counter, sipping from his favorite chipped mug, the one that read Space Nerd in faded blue letters. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Jalen broke the silence without looking up. Did you hear him? Kelvin glanced over, his brow lifting. Your teacher? Jalen nodded, stirring his cereal in slow circles. When I told him you worked at NASA, he laughed. Kelvin set down his mug, crossing the room until he stood beside his son. He didn't try to soften it, didn't jump to say it's okay, because it wasn't. Yeah, he said quietly. I heard. Jalen's spoon tapped against the bowl. Why do people do that? Kelvin took a breath, leaning down so they were eye level. Because sometimes, he said slowly, people see the world in a small box. And when something doesn't fit inside that box, they laugh. Not because it's funny, but because they can't understand it. Jalen's eyes flicked up, searching his father's face. Was he trying to be mean? Kelvin shook his head. Not always. Sometimes it's not hate. Sometimes it's just ignorance. Jalen let that settle, stirring his cereal again. I didn't feel smart anymore. Those words hit harder than anything all day. Kelvin leaned forward, voice soft but firm, the kind of voice you remember long after the conversation is over. Don't ever let someone else's doubt erase your truth, son. You know who you are. You know who I am. That's what matters. Jalen didn't say anything at first. Then he nodded, just a little, like a seed had been planted inside him. And for what it's worth, Kelvin added with a small smile, you did good today. You told the truth. You stood your ground. That's braver than most people will ever be. Jalen looked up fully now, the corners of his mouth lifting just a little. The truth hadn't needed applause. It had only needed him to say it. The next morning, something was different at Prescott Elementary. The air felt lighter. Not because the sun was shining any brighter, or because recess came early, but because something had quietly shifted the day before, and now the kids could feel it even if they couldn't explain it. When Jalen walked into class, backpack slung casually over one shoulder, he didn't expect anything to change. He wasn't looking for smiles or whispers. He didn't need them, but they came anyway. One boy slid over on the reading rug to make space beside him. Another leaned across the aisle during spelling drills to ask, almost shyly, has your dad ever met an astronaut? During lunch, a girl from another table asked if Jalen could bring one of his dad's space tools next time. The same kids who had laughed yesterday now wanted to sit closer, listen harder, ask more. Jalen didn't puff up. He didn't gloat. He answered their questions simply, politely, without the need to prove anything. Because he already knew the truth. Out on the playground, Mila walked beside him quietly, sneakers crunching on the gravel. She glanced over, smiling softly. They believe you now. Jalen shrugged, glancing at the sky like he wasn't thinking about them anymore. They didn't have to. In the teacher's lounge, Mr. Bryan sat alone for a long time, sipping lukewarm coffee, staring at the same clipboard that had once felt like a shield. It didn't feel that way now. He didn't just regret the laugh, or the words, or the way he had made Jalen shrink into himself. He regretted forgetting what it meant to believe in someone before they proved anything at all. Later that afternoon, when the kids returned from recess, Jalen found something tucked inside his cubby. A folded piece of paper scribbled in blue ink. It wasn't a form or a printed school announcement. It was a handwritten note. Jalen, it read, I was wrong. You shouldn't have had to prove anything to us. Keep dreaming big. Mr. Bryan. Jalen read it once. He didn't smile, didn't read it again. He folded it back up, slipped it quietly into the pocket of his backpack, and zipped it shut. He hadn't needed the apology, but maybe Mr. Bryan had needed to write it. That afternoon, as the final bell echoed down the hallway, Jalen walked out of Prescott Elementary not like a kid who had something to prove, but like a kid who already knew who he was. His steps felt lighter, his head held higher. Not because the other kids now believed him, not because they finally understood, but because nothing about his truth had changed. It had always been true. It had always been enough. The only thing that changed was them. Somewhere inside that classroom, something had cracked open, not just in Mr. Bryan, but in every kid who had laughed without thinking. They'd seen, with their own eyes, what it meant when the impossible walked through the door wearing a NASA badge. And more importantly, they'd seen what it meant to believe in yourself even when no one else does. That night, as the Arizona sky faded into deep blue, Jalen sat at the kitchen table again, this time with homework spread out in front of him. Kelvin passed by, ruffling his son's hair on the way to the sink. They didn't talk about what happened at school. They didn't need to, because the lesson wasn't about NASA badges or space phones or even career day. It was about what happens when you let someone else's doubt define you, and what happens when you don't. In that classroom, Jalen had learned something most adults spend a lifetime chasing. That truth doesn't need permission. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't need anyone to believe it for it to still be true. And sometimes when the world tries to put your dreams in a box, all it takes is one person brave enough to say, that box is too small for me. So if you've ever been doubted, if you've ever been laughed at, told to shrink your dreams, or asked to be more realistic, remember this: the limits other people try to place on you, they aren't yours to carry. Keep speaking your truth. Keep showing up. And if you ever find yourself in the position to believe in someone when nobody else will, do it. You might just change their life. Or even better, you might remind them they were right all along. And if there's one thing this story reminds us, it's this: words matter. A laugh can crush a dream. A single comment can make a child question everything they believe about themselves. But the truth? The truth doesn't need applause. It doesn't need permission. It doesn't need to fit neatly inside anyone's expectations. All it needs is someone brave enough to say it out loud. So the next time someone doubts you, laughs at your dream, or tells you to be realistic, I want you to remember Jalen. Remember that sometimes the people who laugh first are the ones who understand last. And your truth? It's not defined by their small imagination. It's defined by you. Sparkles, if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been laughed at for dreaming too big, keep dreaming anyway. Keep speaking your truth. And one day, when the moment comes, you'll walk through the door and change everything. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. If it touched your heart, if it made you think, or even brought a smile to your face, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave a comment below. I'd love to know what dreams you're holding on to. And of course, if you enjoy powerful, emotional stories like this one, make sure you subscribe to Mr. Michael Stories and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Because here, we believe in stories that inspire, heal, and remind you of one simple thing: your voice matters, your dreams matter, and the world is always better when you show up exactly as you are. I'll see you in the next story.